So if you look at my final slide, I titled it During COVID-19, People Dream Deeper. I think partially it's because people have been getting more sleep, hopefully, if they have safe homes to sleep in, and which is, I know, not for everyone. But I do think that it's time for dreams. And the reason I say that is if we accept that this is a transformation and not a temporary crisis, and we're not going to go back to the normal that brought us COVID-19, and we're not going to go back to the normal that was very extractionist, also with respect to international students and global education, then this is also a possibility to dream another future. So I think what we can do right now is to look at places where the kind of changes that I've kind of told you about, which we're sensing or maybe experiencing because we're using Zoom or Discord or what have you, but where they're intensively already playing out is in the UK. So I think it's really an important time to look at how some of our colleagues and friends in the UK have been responding to some of these changes. I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's concerns around shutdowns of universities because they don't have the financial resources anymore. Some universities are potentially going to go online. Top universities are saying they'll expand their acceptance rate of students for these online courses, which would then impact the other universities that are in lower tiers, et cetera, whatever these tiers mean. And I think it's very interesting to look at the UCU strikes, where the unions have already been making these demands. So showing that the conditions we see under COVID-19 are not just enabled by COVID-19, but they're sped up by it, right? Like the sort of financialization and commercialization of education, the going online, right? Like these things have been happening for the last 20 years. We're just seeing them speed up forward, and we're seeing their impact, how they're going to hurt us in a kind of much more visible way. So that is, of course, very depressing, but at the same time, it makes something visible that was happening slowly, so it allows us to react, right? It makes things more concrete. So I think we can learn a lot around from the colleagues in the UK who made sure that they closed ranks. So, for example, the faculty made sure that the staff who were taking care of the buildings and the physical institution were not fired, or that the temporary contract people were protected, that students were not kicked out of dorms. I think at Goldsmith, for example, a lot of the students lived in their studios, right? And of course, in many cases, they lost because, there is a public health issue and it's a very strong argument. It's a difficult one to deal with, but at least they stood in solidarity. And I think it's really important not to lose sight of these different parts of what makes the physical university and an educational institution that serves the public possible, and to put efforts into keeping them together. I think we haven't been doing enough of this work, and I think we can take some inspiration from friends and colleagues in the UK on how to do this. I do think that we have a great opportunity right now to see universities as sites of international solidarity instead of global extraction. I think it becomes so clear that international students were the cash cows of the university, and this was unacceptable, right? Like the differences in the tuitions were unacceptable. The fact that those tuitions were going to be rising next year in the Netherlands was unacceptable, right? And a lot of this would just go under the table. They would be just one little decision at a time. And I think now we have the possibility to say, no, we're going to stay in solidarity with those students, and we're going to think about what it means to have education that allows us to be in touch without reinforcing global extraction. It's a very hard question, but I think it's a very fantastic question and a great moment to open that possibility. Also to learn about tactics and counter strategies, right? I keep on giving the example of the students in China. I don't know if it's an urban myth that gave really bad ratings to the educational app that was forced upon them, and so it was removed from the app stores. So I think there's going to be a lot of learning from different strategies that are being tried in different countries, and then using those to be one step ahead of institutions doing like these sneaky moments of saying, this is what we're going to introduce now, and then being able to counter it in kind of meaningful ways. I think especially those fields where the materiality of practices matter, I think have a great role to play in reminding us and showing and making clear that the materiality of practice, and I should have added here, the publicness of our practice really matters, and we need to insist on that and show avenues of, how would I say it, like to keep the material and public alive, to develop those practices, even though we're stuck in rectangles, right? Like we still can go out a little bit, right? Yes, and there is police out there, and they're over-policing certain neighborhoods more than others and certain people more than others. So how do we use these kind of different conditions and make them visible and open them up for intervention? Especially because now what we're seeing is that the public is going to be an extremely controlled space, right? People are going to be scared. We have the contact tracing apps coming. Everything is going to be seen as risk. The conception of risk comes in between people. So we can think ahead of how to open public space again and how to make material practice again possible. And I think this is a great moment to think about that very carefully and to resist the rectangles, right? I think in terms of institutional integrity, the forces on these institutions to be hollowed out and to be unbundled is going to be very big. And I think we can do the job of asking, especially administration, for transparency on finances. So economic pressure is seeping into the very basic terms that are being used to introduce measures, like what is essential and what does it mean to stand in solidarity. When a lot of universities asked their personnel and their students to stay in solidarity with the economic pressures on the institution rather than standing in solidarity with each other, right? Like all of these slippages, I think, are things that we can work on. We have the capacity to work on, and it's really important to do so. With respect to technology, I think it's really important to see these as our tools and infrastructure and to scrutinize them and also think sometimes of refusal as an option. I know that Sita Pena Gangadaran and also others in the US have been very articulated about refusal as an option to what they call predatory inclusion. So being part of the system is a predatory act in itself. So I think, again, developing practices and making those visible to broader publics that are not individualized. So it's not about, what used to be like, don't use Facebook, well, now don't use Zoom. But it should be, ask your institutions not to stipulate Zoom, right? And there's also, I think, a lot of moral and ethical questions also about, an institution saying, use a tool like Zoom, which is terrible on privacy, terrible on security, terrible on economics, right? So bring up those questions and push for alternative ways of framing the use of technology that is also cognizant of their economic impact. And I think finally, I know this should not be just a footnote, but I really think it's a time to reimagine the future of the university and the future of society. So if universities are not going to be these extraction machines, and if they're not going to have international students that are zooming around, if they're not going to be just, digested into a cloud infrastructure, if they are going to change, then we can start thinking about what that change looks like. And I think right now, the administrators or the people who are running our institutions are making those changes so we can have a say and we can ask for something different to happen. And I think here it's really important to look at, for example, the people who feel very comforted from staying at home. I've heard that even from teenagers, which I'm really surprised about, saying they're very happy to be outside of the pressures of their educational institutions. So what kind of educational institutions could we build or demand or imagine that doesn't have this kind of pressure that when we go home, we're like super happy we're out of there, even if it's a lockdown and we're stuck at home for weeks, right? And how could a future university fulfill the needs of communities and provide care or teach us how to be so caring so that we don't have the kind of collapses that we had when COVID-19 hit, where parts of the society were unprotected, they had to serve anyways, and they are hit really hard while others are being locked down. Like, this seems like a really bad story. So what is the university that would enable a better society and therefore invest in greater social justice? I think we need to imagine that now and demand it from the institutions that seem to be very open to change all of a sudden.